The lease was standard, 12 months, first and last, utilities included. I signed it on a Tuesday morning, without reading past the second paragraph, because I was 29 years old and starting over in a city where I knew exactly no one, and I did not have the bandwidth for fine print. The address was good, the photos were clean. The price was fair. I clicked accept, wired the deposit, told myself this was what fresh starts looked like: efficient, practical, survivable. I showed up with 2 suitcases and a coffee I had not finished. The door opened, and the woman holding the keys to my new apartment was the one I had promised, 6 years ago, to marry. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. Imogen Darce did not look like someone who had been waiting for an apology for 6 years. She looked like someone who had stopped waiting around year 3, rebuilt the infrastructure of her life around the absence of one, and was now deeply inconvenienced by the sight of me on her front stoop. She was 34 years old. She was wearing dark trousers and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms and the collar left open, the way people wear things when they were dressed for a meeting and are now managing the rest of a Wednesday in the same clothes. Her hair was shorter than I had known. It's still dark, still heavy, but cut close at the sides now, swept back. Her eyes were the same, clear and direct, and the exact gray-green of Lake Michigan on a cloudy morning, which I mention only because I had spent the better part of 6 years not letting myself think about the color. She held a set of keys. I held a large coffee and the specific expression of a person watching the floor fall out from under their fresh start. We looked at each other. The city moved around us in the way cities move: indifferent, continuous, entirely uninterested in the convergence happening on the front steps of a Lincoln Park brownstone. Somewhere behind me, a cab was pulling away from the curb with the 2 suitcases I had asked the driver to leave on the sidewalk. The building itself was beautiful in the way old Chicago buildings are beautiful: limestone and brick, casement windows, a garden-level entry that opened onto a small courtyard with a wrought iron gate. It had looked like this in the photos. The photos had not included Imogen. "Rowan," she said. Her voice was the same. I had been afraid of that. Lower than most people expected, and precise, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to fill a room. She said my name the way she said everything, without wasting a syllable, without any of the surprise or the fracture I would have needed to see, to feel less alone in what was happening. "Imogen," I said. 1 word, her name in my mouth, after 6 years of not saying it to anyone except the inside of my own head. It landed differently than I expected. Not small, the opposite, like saying it had taken up all the air on the stoop. She looked at me for another second. Then she looked at the suitcases on the sidewalk. "You need help with those," she said. Not a question. "I can manage," I said. She nodded. She held out the keys. The keychain was a small brass ring, with 2 keys and a card for the building's property management app, the app I had used to sign the lease, to wire the deposit, to communicate with a property contact named Hayes Okafor, who had answered every question I had asked about the unit with professional efficiency, and whose name was on approximately every email I had received about this apartment, except, apparently, the ones that mattered. "3rd floor," she said. "Elevator is at the end of the foyer. Key fob opens the building entrance, same one opens the laundry room in the basement. Unit key is the brass one." She was giving me the practical information, the way she gave all practical information accurately and without affect, making it clear that whether I was a stranger or a catastrophe, the information was the same. The building had an elevator. The laundry room was in the basement. These were facts that did not change based on who was receiving them. "Thank you," I said. "Hayes will be in on Friday," she said. "If you need anything before then, you can use the app." She stepped aside to let me through. The foyer of the building was cool and high-ceilinged, original tile on the floor, a row of brass mailboxes on the right wall, the elevator at the far end, the kind of small cage elevator that old Chicago buildings sometimes have restored, not original, the kind of restoration that costs more than replacement, but preserves something worth preserving. I noted this because noting architectural details was the only thing I could do that was not reacting to the smell of the building cedar and old stone and something floral I could not identify, the smell of a place that had been cared for steadily for years. I pressed the elevator button. Imogen was still in the doorway behind me. I turned. "I did not know," I said. She looked at me. The light from outside made her hard to read. That was fine. She had always been hard to read, even in the years when I had believed I knew her completely. "About the apartment?" she said. "About you," I said. "I would not have signed if I had known it was you." A pause. The elevator arrived with a soft mechanical sound. "The unit is good," she said. "You got a fair price." "That's not what I said." She looked at the elevator. Then back at me. "I know what you said," she said. She turned and went back through the front door. The door did not slam. That was somehow worse, the controlled, deliberate close of it, the complete absence of the satisfying violence I would have understood. I rode the elevator to the third floor, holding my coffee and the keys, and 6 years of things I had decided I was never going to have to say to anyone in this city, because I had not known there was anyone in this city to say them to. The apartment was beautiful. I had known this from the photos. But photos are always a little dishonest in the way that complimentary things are always a little dishonest. They show the shape of the goodness without the specific texture of it. The apartment was the entire top floor of the brownstone original hardwood, casement windows on 3 sides, a kitchen with white tile, and a window over the sink that looked down into the courtyard. The ceilings were high. The light was the particular quality of late afternoon Chicago light in October, which is something like gold filtered through the memory of a better season. Imogen had designed this. I understood that immediately, without being told. The way you understand the work of someone you have known in their professional, becoming the structural reasoning behind every choice, the commitment to original materials, the way the light was considered in the placement of each window rather than being an accident of the original architect's decisions. I set my coffee on the kitchen counter and stood in the middle of the empty apartment and thought very carefully about what I was going to do. I could break the lease. There were probably provisions for it. I could call Hayes on Friday and explain that personal circumstances required me to vacate immediately, and I could find a short-term rental, and I could start over with a different listing on a different platform with more thorough research. I could do all of this and it would be efficient, and it would be a choice I had made before, in a different configuration, and it would cost me the same thing it had cost me then, the version of myself that stays. I unpacked the first suitcase instead. My name is Rowan Calloway. I am 29 years old, and I have been a staff writer at 3 different publications in 2 different countries in the past 6 years, and I came to Chicago in October for a senior editor position at a magazine that covers urban architecture and design, which was ironic in a way I was not going to think about. I know how to land in a city and make it functional. I know how to find the good coffee and the right grocery store, and the route that avoids the worst of the commute traffic. I know how to make a place work without making it home. I had not made anywhere home since I was 23. I was aware of this fact, the way I was aware of most uncomfortable facts about myself completely, and without particular intention to change it. I had not expected Chicago to be the place where that changed. I had not expected anything about Chicago except the job and the city and the start. I had not expected Imogen. My first morning in the apartment, I woke up early. Chicago in October is a particular kind of morning, cold enough that the windows fog from the inside and the building heat comes on with a radiator clank that sounds like the building clearing its throat. The light through the east-facing casement was thin and gray and honest. I made coffee in a pot I had found in the back of the kitchen cabinet left by a previous tenant, clean, adequate, and stood at the window over the sink, looking down into the courtyard. Imogen was in the courtyard. She had a coffee of her own and a phone she was looking at, and she was wearing a dark coat over what looked like the same linen shirt, or one of several identical ones. She was standing near the far wall of the courtyard, where someone had planted a climbing rose that had been cut back for winter, just the canes now, bare and architectural. She was looking at her phone with the focused attention she brought to everything, and then she looked up, at the window, at me. I did not move, neither did she. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked back at her phone, finished her coffee, and went back inside through the ground floor door. I stood at the window for a long time after. The building had 4 units. I had the 3rd floor, There was a second-floor unit occupied by a long-term tenant named Professor Osei, who was elderly and kept his own hours. The garden-level unit was vacant. The ground floor was Imogen's. I had not processed, signing the lease, that this meant I would be living in the same building as my landlady. The listing had described the property as owner-managed, which I had taken to mean property manager-managed, which was technically what the Hayes arrangement was, owner-managed. Hayes managed on behalf of the owner who lived on the ground floor. I added this to the list of things I had not read past the second paragraph. Celeste arrived on Thursday with a rental van and a level of energy that had been her primary characteristic since we were 19 years old at university, and she had decided in the second week of term that I was going to be her best friend, and had then made this happen through sheer productive force. She backed the van into the alley beside the building and directed the two young men from the rental company through the building's narrow stairwell with the calm authority of someone who had moved apartments 6 times in 8 years and had opinions about furniture clearance. I was carrying a box of books up the stairs when Imogen opened her door. She looked at the process. She looked at Celeste, who had paused on the landing to assess the angle of a bookshelf. She looked at me. "Moving help?" I said. "This is Celeste. She's efficient." Celeste turned around. She took in Imogen with the comprehensive and immediate assessment she brought to all new information. Celeste worked in urban planning and had the planner's habit of evaluating the built environment and the people inhabiting it with equal and frank attention. "Hi," Celeste said. "You must be the landlady." Imogen said. She did not add anything else. She looked at the bookshelf situation on the landing, then at the stairs, then back at Celeste. "Tilt it 7 degrees, she said. "The handrail will clear." Celeste tilted the bookshelf 7 degrees. The handrail cleared. Imogen went back inside. Celeste waited until the door clicked shut. Then she turned to me with an expression that could only be described as actively processing. She said, quietly, "That's not a landlady." I started back up the stairs. "That is a situation," Celeste said, following me. "It is not a situation," I said. "She said your name with her eyes, Rowan. Her eyes said your name. I am telling you this as a person who has studied built environments for 11 years. That woman has load-bearing feelings about you that are holding up a significant amount of structural weight." I set the box down in the living room and turned around. "Her name is Imogen," I said. "She is my landlady. It is not a situation." Celeste looked at me with the particular patience of a woman who has known me for 10 years and is currently deciding how much to say. "You called her Imogen," she said. "Yes. Not the landlady, not Miss Darce, Imogen." I moved to the window. Celeste sat on one of the boxes and waited. She was good at waiting. It was, in my experience, the most devastating skill a person could have in a friendship. "We were engaged," I said. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the actual information has arrived. "At 23, I said. "I took a journalism fellowship in London. We tried long distance." I extended. I stopped. "Someone else, briefly. She found out, she ended it." Celeste said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "When did you find out she was the landlady?" "When she opened the door," I said. Celeste looked at the door, then back at me. "And you signed a 12-month lease," she said. "I signed a 12-month lease." She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman calculating structural load. "You're going to have to apologize to her," she said. "I know. Properly. Not the version where you apologize and then leave." "I know, Rowan." "I know, Celeste," I said. "I know." She stood up. She picked up an empty box. She said, "Let's finish moving you in, and then I want to hear the whole story, and then we'll figure out what you're going to say to the woman whose building you just moved into." We finished moving by 7 o'clock. Celeste ordered food and I told her the whole story, which took longer than I expected because it was the first time I had told all of it to anyone, the extension, the mistake, the specific way Imogen had said my name when she called to end the engagement, not cold and not broken, just precise, the way she said everything important. "This is not working. I need you to know I understand. I need you to not call me for a while." And then, 6 years of not calling. Celeste listened to all of it. When I finished, she sat with it for a moment, in the way she sat with things, not rushing to the conclusion, running the structural assessment first. She said, "You've been running from this for 6 years." I said, "I haven't been running. I've been working." She said, "Those aren't mutually exclusive." I looked at my food. She said, "You signed a 12-month lease in her building." "I know. Maybe you knew," Celeste said. "Maybe part of you chose this building because you felt, without knowing why, that it was the right place to stop running. That is the most structurally generous interpretation of a subliminal apartment search I have ever heard." Celeste smiled. "It's also the most accurate." She left at 9. I heard the van start in the alley below, and then the city was quiet around me, and I was alone in Imogen's building, with my boxes half unpacked, and the radiator clanking, and the knowledge that I owed someone an apology I had been carrying for 6 years and not delivering. I went to bed at 10. I did not sleep for a long time. Friday arrived with Hayes. Hayes Okafor was 45 years old, wore tortoiseshell glasses, and had the precise and unhurried energy of a person who had been managing properties for 20 years and had seen everything twice. She arrived at 10 with a building information packet and went through the practical details: trash pickup, recycling, the building's emergency maintenance line, the policy for guests in the common areas. She did not mention Imogen. I mentioned Imogen. "Miss Darce and I have a prior connection," I said. "I wasn't aware she was the owner when I signed the lease. If there's a provision for early termination." Hayes looked at me over the glasses. "The lease is valid," she said. "I know it's valid. If you want to request early termination, the fee structure is in the packet." I looked at the packet. "Is Miss Darce aware that I have a prior connection with her?" I asked. Hayes took a small pause. The kind professionals take when the honest answer is yes and the professional answer is, "That's not my information to share." "The building application includes a personal reference check," she said. "Miss Darce reviews all applications before approval." I stared at her. "She approved my application," I said. Hayes adjusted her glasses. "The unit is yours for 12 months, she said. "You'll find the maintenance calendar on page 4. She left me with the packet and the information and the very specific understanding that Imogen had reviewed my rental application, had seen my name, had known I was coming, and had opened the door with a set of keys and the composed face of a woman who had made a deliberate choice. I sat with that for a long time. She had approved the lease. She had known. She had opened the door anyway. I did not know what that meant. I knew what I wanted it to mean, which was a separate and dangerous thing. The building had a shared laundry room in the basement. I discovered this at 7 on Saturday morning, when I carried my first load down and found Imogen already there, folding what appeared to be a considerable volume of dark, well-made clothing, with the focused efficiency she applied to everything. She looked up when I came in. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. The laundry room was small. There was no way for it to be anything other than small 2 washers, 2 dryers, a folding counter, a utility sink, a single bulb overhead that someone had replaced with something warmer than fluorescent. The room smelled of detergent and old concrete and, under that, the cedar and something floral that seemed to be specific to Imogen, or to her laundry, or to both. I loaded the washer. She continued folding. The machines ran. Neither of us said anything for a full 2 minutes. "You approved the application," I said. She creased a shirt with the edge of her palm. "Yes." "You knew it was me." "Yes." "Why?" I asked. She folded the shirt, set it on the stack, reached for the next one. "Because the unit is good," she said, "and the application was qualified. And making a housing decision based on personal history would have been unprofessional." "That is a very careful answer," I said. She looked at me. "Yes," I said. "I need you to say it differently." The washer ran. She held the shirt in both hands. "I wanted to know if you were all right," she said. "Your application said you were relocating from New York." She stopped. "I wanted to know if you had landed somewhere." I stared at her. "Landed somewhere," I said. She went back to folding. The shirt was finished. She set it on the stack. She turned to me with her hands folded in front of her, not defensive, just occupied, the way her hands were always occupied when she was being more honest than she had planned to be. I did not expect you to show up in person, she said. I thought Hayes would do the walkthrough. I was prepared for you to be upstairs and for us to have a professional arrangement that did not require this. This? I said. This, she agreed, gesturing briefly at the space between us. And when you opened the door and I was there? I said. She looked at the folded laundry. It was more difficult than I anticipated, she said. That was the most she had ever underused a word. I said, I want to explain. She picked up the laundry basket. Her face was composed in the harder way now, the one that required more effort, and showed it at the edges, just barely, if you had learned where to look. I know what happened, Rowan, she said. I have known for 6 years. I don't need you to explain it. I need to explain it. She looked at me. Something in her eyes shifted, not softening, something more specific than softening. The particular attention of a woman who is deciding whether a thing is worth the cost of paying for it. Not today, she said. Okay. She moved toward the door, then stopped. The elevator sticks sometimes, she said, without turning around. Hold the button for 3 seconds before it closes. I nodded. She left. I sat on the folding counter and listened to the washer run and thought about the phrase more difficult than I anticipated and what it meant that she had said it without looking at me. October moved through the building, the way October moves through old buildings, cold from the walls first, then the windows, then finally the air itself. The radiators clanked to life at 6 in the morning. The garden level stayed vacant. Professor Osei, on the second floor, kept a window box of hardy mums in rust and orange that bloomed with stubborn persistence until the first frost. I started the new job on the 15th. The magazine was called Form, the kind of one-word title that architecture and design publications favored and had since been too established to change. It covered urban architecture, planning, interior design, and the structural conversation between buildings and the people who moved through them. I was the new senior features editor, brought in specifically for a series on Chicago's adaptive reuse movement, the city's ongoing transformation of industrial and commercial spaces into residential and civic ones. I was, professionally, exactly where I should be. The job was good, the building was good, the apartment was good. The apartment felt like Imogen's building every morning when I woke up, which was information. I was 3 weeks in when I ran into her in the building foyer at 7 in the morning. She was coming in from outside in a dark coat dusted with rain, her hair slightly wet at the edges, carrying architectural drawings in a portfolio case and a coffee from the place 2 streets over that I had also discovered and was now my primary morning source. She held the door for me. I said, "Thank you." She said, "It's raining." I looked outside. It was raining. "I'm going to be late," she said, but she paused. "The building association meeting is the 3rd Thursday of the month. If you want to attend, Hayes has the details." "That is a very professional thing to say to someone whose number you had for 6 years," I said. She looked at me for one brief, unguarded second. Then she said, "3rd Thursday, not the last." She went through the inner door. I stood in the foyer and thought about that unguarded second and what was inside it. I had always been able to see inside her unguarded seconds. That had been one of the specific things I had been most afraid of losing and had, in fact, lost, and was now apparently getting small installments of back in a building foyer, in the rain. I did not know what to do with installments. The incident that moved the pattern was not dramatic and took place at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening in early November when the building's elevator stopped between the 2nd and 3rd floors with me in it. It did not alarm me immediately. The building was old. Old buildings had old machinery. I pressed the button for the ground floor and it did not respond, and I pressed the emergency call button, which connected to a maintenance line that, at 9:30 on a Tuesday, went to voicemail. I called Hayes. Voicemail. I sent the building app a maintenance request. Then, because the cell signal was adequate, and the elevator was not uncomfortable, and I had learned in a decade of journalism to treat unexpected pauses as research time, I sat on the elevator floor and opened my laptop and began reviewing copy for the following week's issue. 22 minutes later, the elevator began to move. Imogen was in the ground floor lobby when the doors opened. She was in a worn gray sweater and dark trousers, her feet in what appeared to be house slippers, the kind of detail that was so domestic and unexpected that it recalibrated the entire room. She had a phone in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been in the middle of something when the maintenance alert came through and had come straight from it. She looked at me on the floor with my laptop. "The override code is in the building app," she said. "Emergency panel." "I didn't know there was an override code," I said. "Page 11 of the packet." I did not read past page 4. A very small thing happened to her face. Not a smile, something adjacent to one. The kind of reaction that happens before you can stop it. I stood up. She stepped aside. "Thank you for coming down," I said. She held the elevator door. "Are you all right?" she asked. I said, "The copy I was editing is actually better now. I think the elevator improved my judgment." She looked at the copy visible on my laptop screen. "What's the article?" "Adaptive reuse of an industrial building in Pilsen," I said. "There's a load-bearing wall the developer wants to remove, and the preservation board wants to keep, and the architect has proposed a structural solution that I stopped." "You're an architect?" "Yes." "What do you think about removing load-bearing walls?" She looked at me for a moment. Then, she looked at the laptop screen. "Can I see?" She held the elevator door with one hand and took the laptop I offered with the other. She read for approximately 30 seconds. The foyer was quiet. The building hummed. "The structural solution is correct," she said. "The problem isn't the wall. The problem is that the developer is treating the wall as the obstacle rather than the asset. The wall tells the story of what the building was. Remove it and you have a space. Keep it and you have a building." I looked at her. "I'm interviewing the architect on Thursday," I said. "Jimenez?" she asked. "Rosario Jimenez. She's right. Her solution is right. Tell her I said so." "Tell her," Imogen Dar said, "the solution is right," I said. "She's a former student. She'll know what it means." She released the elevator door. It began to close. I stepped out into the lobby. She turned to go back toward her door. "Imogen," I said. She stopped. The packet had 12 pages and I read to 4. But I read the part where it says you approved the lease personally. She did not turn around. "Yes," she said. "I wanted you to know that I know you chose to have me here," I said. "I don't know yet what that means. But I wanted you to know that I know." A pause. The building hummed. Her back was very still. "Good night, Rowan," she said. "Good night." She went through her door. I stood in the foyer in my coat, holding my laptop, in the specific quiet that follows a conversation that has left something open between two people, and both of them know it. I went upstairs. I rewrote the problematic paragraph in the Pilsen article and used the phrase, "The wall tells the story of what the building was," and did not credit anyone for it. I made the mistake of looking her up 3 weeks into living in the building, something I had not done in 6 years, because looking her up meant finding her, and finding her meant confronting the specific shape of what I had walked away from. Imogen Dar's architecture. Established 8 years ago, the year after we ended. The website was clean and deliberate, the same aesthetic economy as the building app, as the laundry room with its warmer-than-fluorescent bulb. The portfolio was significant. Residential and adaptive reuse, primarily with 3 civic projects. She had won awards. She had been profiled in Form My magazine 4 years ago, in an issue I had not read, because I had been in New York not reading Chicago publications because Chicago was where she was. I sat with my coffee and read the profile from 4 years ago. The interviewer had asked her about her design philosophy. She had said, "Buildings are responsible to the life inside them. My job is to understand what that life needs and then get out of the way and let the structure serve it." I read that 3 times. Then I closed the browser and called Celeste. "I read her profile in the magazine," I said. Celeste said, "And?" I said, "She's good. She's really good." "She's been good for a long time," Celeste said, with the gentleness of someone who is being kind about a fact the other person already knows. "I know, Rowan." "I know," I said. Celeste said, "Have you apologized yet?" "No. Are you going to?" "Yes." "When?" "When I know how to do it without it being about me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most self-aware thing you have said about her in 6 years." "I know. You're going to be fine," Celeste said. "You're both going to be fine, but you need to stop preparing the apology and start giving it." "I know." "Give her the apology, Rowan. And then stay." "I know." It was a Wednesday night when I knocked on her door. I had been awake since 5. I had written 3 drafts of the Pilsen article and deleted 2 of them. I had gone for a run along the lakefront in 40-degree weather and come back still awake, in the way that running makes you awake instead of tired, when the thing running alongside you is not going to be left behind. I knocked at 8 in the evening. She answered in dark trousers and a soft gray sweater with her reading glasses on and a book in one hand. Reading glasses. I had never seen her in reading glasses. They were round and steel-framed, and she wore them with the same uncommon ease she wore everything, and the specific domesticity of it hit me somewhere unguarded. She looked at me. She looked at the lack of reason for me to be at her door at 8 in the evening. I said, "I owe you something, and I have been preparing to give it to you for 3 weeks, and I have decided that preparation is not what is actually required." She stepped back. I came inside. Her apartment was what I had suspected, calibrated the way she calibrated everything, the space serving the life inside it with a precision that did not announce itself. Warm, deliberate, every object placed with consideration that did not call attention to itself. Books everywhere, sorted by a logic I did not immediately understand but that I knew, without needing to understand it, was hers. A drafting table in the corner, with a lamp on a flexible arm, drawings spread across it. A kitchen that was slightly warmer than a kitchen usually is, which meant she had been in it recently. She sat on the arm of the sofa. She set the book down. She looked at me. I remained standing because I needed to be standing to say this properly. "I took the fellowship because I wanted it," I said. "That part is true, and I'm not apologizing for it because it was a legitimate choice." She said nothing. "I extended," I said, "because I was afraid of coming back. Afraid of what coming back meant, the decisions, the permanence, the specific weight of the life we had been building together, and what it would require of me to stay inside it. I told myself it was the work. It was partly the work. It was mostly fear." I stopped. She was very still. "The person in London," I said, "was a mistake. It lasted 6 weeks. It was over before you found out. I ended it. None of that makes it better. I am not offering it as mitigation. I am offering it as the full account of what happened, which you deserve to have." The apartment was quiet. The drafting lamp hummed. Outside, a car passed. "You ended the engagement instead of calling me," I said. "I understand why. I have understood why for 6 years, and I have not been able to argue with it. You were correct. And I am sorry, not for the fellowship, which was mine to take, but for the extension, and for the mistake, and for the 6 years of not saying this to you because saying it required me to be in a room with you." I stopped. She looked at me. I said, "That's the apology, the whole version." She was quiet for a long time. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her reading glasses were on the table beside the book. In the lamplight, without them, she looked like the version of herself that had existed before she had decided that composure was the only container strong enough to hold everything else. She said, "I know you ended it. Before I called. I waited." She said, "I knew in the way you know things you don't want to know, from the texture of the conversations before, from the way you stopped saying certain things, from a message you sent that was slightly different in tone, and I filed away and didn't open all the way because I didn't want to know what was in it." She looked at her hands. "When I called," she said, "I had already decided. The person in London was the evidence, not the reason." I said, "What was the reason?" She was quiet for a moment. "You were not coming back," she said. "Not because of them, because of you. Because coming back required you to commit to the specific weight of it. And I had been watching you decide, across 2 years, that the weight was more than you wanted to carry." The lamp hummed. The apartment was very still. I said, "You were right." She looked up at me. I said, "I was not ready to carry it. I was 23 and afraid, and I chose the thing that felt survivable over the thing I wanted. I have spent 6 years becoming a person who knows the difference between those two things, and I am not asking you to." I stopped. I am not asking you to do anything with that information, I just needed you to have it. She stood. She moved to the drafting table and stood with her back to me, her hands flat on the drawings. Her shoulders rose once with a breath. I said, Imogen. She turned around. She said, I spent 2 years being angry, and 2 years being relieved, and 2 years not thinking about it at all. And then I got your rental application, and I stood in this room for a very long time and thought about what it would mean if I declined it. I said, Why didn't you? She said, Because I wanted to know if you were different. The lamp cast everything in gold. She was 8 feet away from me, and the room felt much smaller than that. Are you? She asked. Different? Yes. I looked at her. I thought about the last 6 years, the cities, the work, the specific cost of being in motion and calling it freedom. I thought about signing a lease, sight unseen, and landing in her doorway, and staying, 3 weeks in, when I could have broken the lease and run. I said, I think so. I think I'm still finding out. She nodded. Something in her face was very close to something I recognized. She said, Thank you for the apology. I said, Thank you for approving the lease. The corner of her mouth moved. That one costly millimeter. She picked up her reading glasses. She put them back on. Good night, Rowan, she said. Good night. I let myself out. I went upstairs in the elevator, holding the button for 3 seconds the way she had told me, and stood in my apartment in the dark for a long time before I turned on any lights. The city was visible through the east-facing casements, the lights of Lincoln Park, the dark stripe of the lake beyond, the particular Chicago skyline that I had not let myself think about in 6 years because it belonged to a version of my life I had left behind. I was in her building. I was inside the radius of the life I had walked away from 6 years ago. Not the same version of it, but inside the radius of it. And I had stayed 3 weeks and I had said the thing and I had not run. That was, as far as I knew, the most important thing I had done in recent memory. She found me in the building courtyard on Sunday morning. Not deliberately. I had gone out with coffee because the courtyard was the one outdoor space the building had, and October in Chicago was the end of the window for using it, and I did not want to miss the last of the season. The wrought iron bench, near the climbing rose canes, was cold but manageable. The sky was that particular thin cloud blue that Chicago does in November's edge. Imogen came through the ground floor door with her own coffee and stopped. We looked at each other. I said, I found the bench. She said, I see that. I moved to the end to make room. She looked at the bench, then at the space, then sat. We sat in the courtyard with our coffees in the specific silence of 2 people who have said the important things and are now inside the aftermath, which is a different country from the before and requires its own acclamation. She said, The climbing rose is a Paul's Himalayan musk. It'll have flowers in June if it winters well. I said, Did you plant it? Previous tenant, she said. I've kept it up. I said, You kept a previous tenant's rose. She said, It was a good rose. I looked at the bare canes, the architecture of a thing that would bloom months from now, maintained through the interim by someone who had decided it was worth the upkeep. I said, I interviewed Rosario Jimenez yesterday. How was she? Brilliant, I said. She told me you once said the wall has memory, and the job of the architect is to work with what the building remembers. Imogen looked at her coffee. She's a good architect, she said. She thinks you're an extraordinary one, I said. A pause. She was a remarkable student, Imogen said. She understood things in her second year that most people don't understand until they've been practicing for a decade. I said, The profile in Form 4 years ago. I read it. She went very still. You said buildings are responsible to the life inside them, I said. You said your job was to understand what that life needs and then get out of the way. She said nothing. I said, I've been thinking about that since I read it. I don't remember saying it, she said. You said it. I think you meant it. She looked at the rose canes. Her profile was very clean in the thin November light, the jaw, the line of her throat, the way she held her coffee with both hands, the way she held things when she was being more present than she meant to be. What have you been thinking? She asked. I said, that I don't know if the life in this building is the kind you were talking about, but I think I would like to know what you meant. She turned to look at me. The courtyard was quiet. The city existed at the edges of it: traffic, someone's dog, the particular hum of a neighborhood that had been lived in long enough to develop its own specific sound. Inside the courtyard, the sound was different, older. She said, "I meant that a building's job is not to make a statement. It's to make a life possible, to hold the conditions for something to grow." The rose canes. Yes. I held my coffee. I said, "I think I am trying to learn how to do that. How to hold a condition instead of moving through it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You stayed." I said, "I stayed." She looked back at the rose. "I can't go back," she said. "You understand that." "I know," I said. "What happened is what happened." "I know." She said, "I have built something here. I'm not in the business of taking risks with what I've built." I said, "I'm not asking you to take a risk. I'm asking you to let me be in the building, to let me show you the difference between the person who left and the person who stayed." She looked at me. I said, 12 months, that's what I signed." She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "There's a section in the lease about building community events. The December open house is the first Saturday of the month. Building tenants, some neighborhood people. Hayes organizes it." I said, "I'll be there." She stood, picked up her coffee. She said, "The courtyard heater is in the garden-level storage. If you need it." I said, "Thank you." She went back inside. I sat in the courtyard with my cold coffee and the bare rose canes and the November sky and thought about 12 months, about the difference between a sentence and a beginning, about what it meant that she had not said no and had not said yes and had offered me the courtyard heater instead, which was its own language, and I was fluent in it. I was fluent in her. That was the problem and the possibility in equal measure. I went upstairs. I put the coffee on. I opened my laptop and read the profile from Form again, all of it this time, including the photographs, which showed her at a construction site in the kind of practical work clothes that made her look simultaneously more accessible and more certain of herself than the dark trousers and linen shirts of the building's daily life. Buildings are responsible to the life inside them. I closed the laptop. I looked at my apartment, the high ceilings, the casement windows, the specific warmth of the light at 4 in the afternoon, the building she had restored. The apartment she had built, with the window over the sink that looked down into the courtyard. She had placed that window deliberately. I understood that now. She had wanted whoever lived in this apartment to be able to see the courtyard. I thought about that for a long time. About a woman who had designed a view of a rose she had kept for a tenant she did not know yet, who had sat on a cold bench in November and said, "I wanted to know if you had landed somewhere." I thought about landing, what it required, what I had been refusing to let it require for 6 years. I thought about 12 months, and the first Saturday in December, and the specific weight of a condition being held instead of a distance being maintained. Then I made dinner and did not burn it, and considered that a reasonable measure of progress. The first Saturday in December arrived the way first Saturdays arrive in December in Chicago, cold, bright, the kind of day where the sky is so clear and so blue that the cold seems like a fair trade. The building's front parlor, a room I had not previously accessed, which turned out to be a small formal sitting room off the foyer that Imogen had restored and rented to the building association, for events, was warm with the smell of something mulled and the specific mix of voices that happens when a building's worth of people occupy a shared space for the first time. I arrived at 6:30, because showing up early to a building event when you are the newest tenant and the landlady is the woman you were once engaged to is either a statement or a mistake, and I had decided to let it be a statement. Imogen was already there. Of course she was. She was in a dark turtleneck and trousers, her hair pushed slightly back, the reading glasses absent. She was speaking to an older man in a gray jacket, who turned out to be Professor Osei, who had the measured warmth of someone who had been in the same building for 11 years and had seen several iterations of its tenants and found most of them interesting. She saw me come in. Nothing in her face changed, but she did not look away immediately, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I got a glass of something warm from the table Hayes had set up near the window and stood near the edge of the room and watched the building breathe. Professor Osei found me 20 minutes in. He was 80 years old, had taught urban sociology at a university he mentioned twice without naming, and had the specific intelligence of a man who had been paying attention to rooms and the people in them for most of a century. He shook my hand. "Rowan Calloway," he said. "The writer from Form. Imogen mentioned you were in the third-floor unit." I said, "She mentioned me?" He said, "She mentioned the new tenant." He tilted his head slightly. "Though I find the way she mentioned you rather more specific than the way she mentioned the two before you." I looked at Imogen across the room. She was listening to Hayes describe something on a tablet, her expression attentive and composed, one hand in her pocket. Professor Osei followed my gaze. "She designed this building," he said. "You know that, I think." "I do." "She designed it to be lived in," he said, "not displayed." "There is a difference, and it is not a small one." "I know," I said. He looked at me with the clear patience of someone who has said the accurate thing and is now waiting to see what the person does with it. "She holds things carefully," he said. He said it without weight, just observation, the building, the work, the people in it. He excused himself. I stood with my warm drink and thought about what he had said, and about the window over the kitchen sink, and the rose canes, and the 12-month lease, and about all the various forms that holding something carefully could take. At 8:30, as people were beginning to leave, I found myself in the foyer doorway with Imogen, who had drifted there to say goodbye to a neighbor whose name I had not caught. The room behind us was warm, and the foyer was cool, and the contrast was the particular domestic pleasure of a building that held its heat well. She turned when the neighbor left. We stood in the foyer, in the specific proximity of two people at the edge of a room that is emptying. "Good event," I said. "Hayes organizes it well," she said. I said, "Professor Osei told me you held things carefully." She looked at me. "He says that to everyone," she said. "He said it specifically about you," I said. She was quiet. I said, "I think he was right." She said nothing for a moment. The building hummed around us. The warm, spiced smell from the parlor drifted into the foyer and mixed with the cedar and the cold night air coming under the front door. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Thank you for telling me about it." She turned toward her door. "Imogen," I said. She stopped, turned back. I said, "I know you can't go back. I'm not asking you to. I want you to know that I understand the difference between going back and going forward, and I am only interested in the second one." She looked at me for a long, measured moment. She said, "I know what you're interested in, Rowan." I said, "Good." She said, "I am not ready to be interested in the same thing." I said, "I know." She said, "But I am." She stopped. She looked at the front door, then back at me. "I am not uninterested." The foyer was very quiet. I said, "That's enough." She nodded, opened her door, went inside. I stood in the foyer alone for a long time after the door closed, holding the words "not uninterested" and understanding that from Imogen Darce, composed and careful and responsible to the life inside every structure she had ever built, those words were not a small thing. They were, in fact, the largest thing I had heard in 6 years. I took the elevator up. I held the button for 3 seconds. The elevator did not stick. I went into my apartment and stood at the window over the kitchen sink and looked down into the courtyard, where the bare rose canes caught the lamplight from the courtyard fixture, and where the wrought iron bench was empty and cold, and where, in June, if the winter was kind, there would be flowers. I was going to be here in June. That was not a plan. It was a decision. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. The Pilsen article ran in January. I had not told Imogen it was being published that week. There was no professional reason to tell her she had given me an off-the-record observation about a former student's work, which I had used without attribution, which was the ethical compact of that kind of exchange. She did not need to know when the piece ran. She came upstairs at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, which I knew because I heard the elevator and then a knock at my door, and I opened it in my running clothes with coffee in hand, not yet awake enough to manage the specific calibration required for Imogen in my doorway. She was holding the print edition of Form. She said, "The wall line." I said, "Good morning." She said, The wall tells the story of what the building was. That's from the elevator conversation. I said, you said it in the foyer. She looked at the magazine. Then at me. I said, it was the right line. She said, you should have credited me. I said, you told me off the record. She said, I know. She looked at the page for another moment. It's a good article. It's a good building, I said. She handed me the magazine. She said, Jimenez called me after it ran. She said her phone hasn't stopped. Good, I said. She deserves it. Imogen looked at me in the specific way she looked at things she was deciding whether to say. She said, there's a building on the north side, adaptive reuse, industrial to residential. The owner has a preservation commitment and a developer who is trying to renegotiate it. I'm the architect of record. I said, is that a story? She said, it might be, if you're interested. I said, I'm interested. A pause. The hallway was cold between us, and the apartment was warm behind me, and the contrast was the kind of thing you either step into or you don't. She said, I'll send you the file. I said, or you could have coffee. She looked at the apartment behind me. The drafting table I had set up, the books, the casement windows with the morning light already doing something useful. She said, I have a site visit at 9. I said, you have an hour. She came inside. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and the print edition of Form and went through the Pilsen article the way she went through everything with complete attention and no performance of reading, just reading. I made eggs because I had been going to make eggs, and there was no reason to stop simply because Imogen Darce was sitting at my kitchen table in the January light, looking at my work. She said, you changed the framing in the third section. I said, my editor suggested it, and she was right. She said, the original framing was more accurate. I said, the revised framing is more readable. She considered this. Both, she said, can be true. I said, that's exactly what I told my editor. A pause. She turned a page. I said, tell me about the North Side building. She told me. It was a former printing factory, 6 stories, brick and timber, the kind of building that Chicago had been losing steadily for 30 years to developers who saw square footage and not structure. The owner had purchased it with a preservation covenant. A developer had come in 18 months later with a redesign that technically complied with the covenant and fundamentally violated it. Imogen had been fighting the redesign at the permit level for 4 months. She said, it's not a story yet. It might be one in March, when the permit board rules. I said, who's covering it on the planning side? She said, no one significant. The Tribune ran 2 paragraphs in November. I said, Form covers preservation cases. She said, I know, that's why I'm telling you. I looked at her. She was looking at her coffee. I said, you came upstairs to tell me about a story. She said, I came upstairs about the wall line. I said, and then you told me about the story. She said, the story is relevant to your series. I said, the story is relevant to your case and you think Form coverage would help. She looked at me. I said, I'm not criticizing it, I'm just naming it. She said, both things can be true. I looked at her. She looked at me. The morning light was doing something very specific to the kitchen and neither of us moved for a moment. She stood, picked up her coffee to finish it standing at the counter. I'll send you the file, she said. I said, Imogen. She stopped. That particular stillness. I said, what are we doing? She set down the coffee. She said, I don't know yet. I said, that's honest. She said, I'm working on being honest. It's taking time. I said, I know. I said it without edge, which cost me something. I know it's taking time. I'm not asking you to move faster than you can. She looked at me for a moment. Something in the look was different from the foyer looks and the courtyard looks closer to the way she had looked at me the night of the apology. When the lamp was on and the drafting table was behind her, and she had been 8 feet away with the room feeling much smaller than that. She said, the article is good, Rowan. I said, thank you. She left. I stood in my kitchen with my eggs and my coffee and the print edition of Form, and thought about the specific temperature of a room that someone has just left and how different it is from a room that has simply been empty. Celeste came to Chicago in February. She appeared on a Saturday morning with a weekend bag and the energy of a woman who had been waiting for an update and had decided the update was not arriving fast enough through text messages. She dropped her bag in the middle of my living room and looked at the apartment, the books, the drafting table in the corner, the casement windows with frost at the edges and said, "You've made it home." I said, "I've unpacked." She said, "That is not what I said." She made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the courtyard through the window over the sink. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. The elevator, the laundry room and the phrase more difficult than I anticipated. The December open house and not uninterested. The January morning with the magazine and the North Side building, and both things can be true. Celeste listened with the specific attention of a woman who has been told a complicated building story and is running load calculations. She said. She came upstairs with the magazine. "Yes," she said. "She came to you." "Yes." Celeste turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, "Imogen Darce crossed the threshold she has been holding since October and came to your door on a Thursday morning with a print magazine and told you about a professional favor she could use, and then said, 'I don't know yet,' when you asked what you were doing." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "Rowan, that woman is in love with you." I said, "She's not ready to say." "She came upstairs," Celeste said, with infinite patience. "She is the most composed person you have ever described to me. She operates with absolute precision around the edges of what she will and will not allow herself. And she came upstairs with a magazine on a Thursday morning at 7:30 for a site visit at 9. That is not a professional call. That is a woman who could not wait another day and found a reason." I looked at my coffee. Celeste said, "What are you afraid of?" I said, "That I will do this badly again." She said, "How?" I said, "That I'll get afraid and leave. That history will repeat itself. That I am the kind of person who knows what she wants and cannot stay inside it when it becomes real." Celeste said, "That was the person you were at 23. I said, "People don't change as much as they want to believe." She said, "Some people don't." She looked at me with the specific clarity she reserved for the truest things. "You moved to this city. You found this building without knowing she was in it, or some part of you found it, and the other part didn't ask questions. You have been here for 4 months, and you have not run. What is the evidence that you are still the person who runs?" I didn't answer. She said, "The evidence is 0. The pattern broke when you stayed. You know what the old door looks like, the fellowship logic, the extension, the 'I just need more time.' You know its face. Don't open it." I looked at my food. She said, "You signed a 12-month lease." "I know." She said, "You turned down the Boston offer." I went still. Celeste said, "The features director position at Atlantic Coast. They reached out in November. You told me you weren't interested. That is not a person who is planning to leave." I said, "I wasn't interested." "You weren't interested," she said, "because you are already where you want to be." I didn't answer. She said, "Rowan, you are already home. You know that." She knows that. The only thing that hasn't happened yet is someone saying it out loud. I said, "She needs time." She said, "She does, and you're giving it to her. And that is the most important thing you have done differently from 6 years ago. Don't mistake patience for passivity. They are not the same." I thought about that for a long time. She said, "You should tell her you turned down Boston." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because she approved the lease, not knowing if you were a person who stays. You've spent 4 months showing her you are. She should have the information." I said, "That feels like a move." Celeste said, "It is a move. It's also true. Both things can be true." I looked at her. She smiled. I said, "She said that." "I know," Celeste said. "You've used it 4 times since October." The North Side building permit hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday in March. I had been following the case for 6 weeks. I had read the preservation covenant, reviewed the developer's redesign, spoken to 2 preservation board members, and a planning historian who specialized in industrial adaptive reuse. I attended the public comment session in February, a drafty City Hall hearing room, and watched Imogen present the technical case against the redesign with the precision and completeness of someone who had been preparing this argument since October, and was not going to lose it through inadequate preparation. She was extraordinary. Not in a way that surprised me. I had known she was extraordinary since we were 22. But watching her in that hearing room, in the dark coat and the structured composure, presenting structural evidence with the authority of someone who understood both the building and the legal framework protecting it, that was a different kind of extraordinary. The kind that accumulates. I wrote 700 words of notes and published nothing because it was February and the story was March. I did not tell her I had been there. She found out anyway. 2 days after the public comment session, she sent a message through the building app. The app, we had both tacitly agreed, was for maintenance requests, and also tacitly agreed to use for other communications when neither of us wanted to be the one who asked for a phone number directly. It said, "You were at the February hearing." I wrote back, "The case is strong." She wrote, "I know." I wrote, "The Developers Council is going to argue the covenant language is ambiguous. You need a preservation historian as a secondary witness." A pause of approximately 12 minutes. She wrote, "I have one. Dr. Renata Solis, University of Illinois." I wrote, "I know Renata, she's good." She wrote, "I know you know her. She mentioned it." I stared at my phone. Then I wrote, "Renata mentioned me to you?" She wrote, "She said you were at the February session, and that you were taking notes, and that if a features writer from Form is taking notes for 6 weeks, it's a story." I wrote, "It's a story." In March. She wrote, "After the permit board rules." I wrote, "I won't publish anything that compromises your case." A long pause. She wrote, "I know." 2 words. I sat with them for a moment. Then I wrote, "Imogen." She wrote, "Yes." I wrote, "I turned down a position in Boston in November." The longest pause yet. 4 minutes. I sat with my phone and the building's radiator clanking and the February cold pressing at the casement windows. She wrote, "I know." I stared at that for a long time. She wrote, "Hayes mentioned it. She has a friend at the Atlantic coast. She told me in December." I wrote, "Why didn't you say anything?" She wrote, "Because it was your decision to share or not share." I wrote, "It wasn't a hard decision." Another pause. Shorter this time. She wrote, "I know that too." I put the phone down. I looked at the courtyard from the kitchen window. The rose canes in February were still bare. Would be bare until April at the earliest, possibly May. The wrought iron bench had a skin of frost on it. I picked up the phone. I wrote, "The bench in the courtyard is going to be usable again in April." She wrote, after a moment, "April is a long way from February." I wrote, "I know. I'm practicing patience." The pause was shorter. She wrote, "So am I." The permit board hearing was on a Tuesday. I attended as press. I sat in the 3rd row with my credential and my notebook and watched Imogen present the technical case with Renata Solis as her secondary witness. And I watched the Developers Council try 4 different angles on the covenant language and get shut down at each one by a board member who had clearly read the preservation brief ahead of the session. The board ruled in Imogen's favor 2 hours in. The printing factory would be restored per the covenant. The developer had 60 days to revise the redesign or lose the project. In the corridor outside the hearing room afterward, there was the particular noise of a legal victory, voices overlapping, relief, the shuffling of portfolio cases. Renata Solis found me first. She was 60 years old and had the brisk energy of a woman who had been winning preservation cases for 30 years and had not slowed down. She shook my hand. She said, "The story you're writing about this building, write it as a preservation case, not a design story. The covenant mechanism is the news." I said, "I know, I'm writing it that way." She looked at me. Then she looked past me. She said, "Imogen has been a remarkable architect since she was a student. She's also been," she paused, selecting, "carefully held for a long time." She said it without elaboration. The same register as Professor Osei in December, which made me wonder if the building's world had been watching longer than I realized. She excused herself. Imogen found me 3 minutes later in the corridor, still in the dark coat, the portfolio case at her side. The hearing room noise was around us. She looked at me the way she looked at things immediately after a hard win, not triumphant, just present, the composure intact, and the relief underneath it showing at the edges. She said, "You covered the hearing." I said, "I was always going to cover it." She said, "I know." I said, "You won." She said, "The building won." I said, "You and Renata won it for the building." She looked at the corridor around us, press, planning staff, the developers team heading toward the exit, with the controlled walk of people who have lost and are managing it professionally. She said, quietly, "Are you free tonight?" I looked at her. She said, "I'd like to have dinner. Not the building app. Dinner." I said, "Yes." She said, 7 o'clock, the place on North Clark. I'll send the address. She sent it through the building app. After that, we stopped using it for anything that was not an actual maintenance request. The restaurant on North Clark was the kind of place that had been there for 20 years and knew it warm light, tables that fit 2 people without requiring them to perform intimacy or avoid it. She was there when I arrived, already seated, the dark coat over the back of her chair, civilian clothes underneath, dark trousers, a deep blue shirt, a silver watch on her left wrist I did not remember from 6 years ago. New. Something she had acquired in the time between. I sat down. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said. In the building app." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about patience." I looked at her. She said, "I have not been kind to myself about this. About the application and the lease and the—" She stopped. "The management of it. I have been telling myself that letting you in was a professional decision, and then finding reasons to be in proximity to you that I described to myself as building-related." I said, "The magazine in January." She said, "The magazine was the most transparent one. I was at a site visit at 8:30. I looked at her. She said, "The site visit was at 8:30. I came upstairs at 7:30. There was no efficiency argument for that." I said, "I'm glad you came." She looked at her water glass, then back at me. She said, "I need to say something, and I need to say it clearly because I have been saying everything obliquely for 4 months, and it has been costing both of us." I said, "Okay." She said, "I did not approve the lease as a neutral professional decision. I approved it because your name was on it and I had spent 6 years not knowing if you were all right and I wanted." She stopped. "I wanted you where I could see you. Even though I had no right to want that." The restaurant was warm around us. The noise of other tables was the right kind of distance. I said, "You had every right to want it." She said, "I had no professional right." I said, "Professionally, no. As a person who had loved someone and needed to know they were okay, you had every right." She said, "That's more generous than I deserve." I said, "It's accurate. Those are different things." She said, "Both things can be true." I said, "Yeah." She looked at the table, then back at me. She said, "I want to try. I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly. I have spent 6 years not trying anything that carried this amount of risk. I am careful." I said, "I know." She said, "If you leave." I said, "I'm not leaving. I turned down Boston. I have a 12-month lease that I intend to renew. I am a person who came to this city and found something worth staying for, and I am not going to run from it." She was very still. She said, "I know you're not the person who left at 23. I said, "I know you're not the person who ended the call and never answered again." Something moved across her face, the specific kind of movement that happens when you have been managing a weight for a long time and someone has just offered to help carry it. She said, "No, I'm not. We had dinner for 2 hours. We talked about the printing factory and the permit board and Renata Solis and the specific satisfaction of a well-made technical argument prevailing over a bad faith legal one. We talked about the form series and the piece I was going to write and the way I was planning to frame the covenant mechanism. We talked about Chicago winters and the particular quality of March light and what Professor Osei had said about the building at the December open house. At some point she told me about the year after we ended, not with difficulty, with the clean precision of someone who had processed a thing completely and was now simply reporting on it. She had moved into the Lincoln Park building the following spring, because she owned it and had finished the restoration, and because it was easier than finding somewhere else. She had not found it lonely. She had found it honest, a building she had made and understood, with people whose comings and goings she could track without needing to engage with, which was what she had needed that year. I said, "And then you needed different things," she said, gradually. "Professor Osei has dinner with me twice a month. I know most of my neighbors." I said, "That sounds like a life." She said, "It is. A good one." She said it without defensiveness or apology. "I am not asking you to complete something that was missing. I want you to know that. I'm asking you to add to something that already works." I looked at her. She said, "I know that's not a romantic thing to say." I said, "It's the most romantic thing you've said to me. You're not asking me to save you. You're asking me to stay because you want me here. That is the only version of this I know how to be inside." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. We talked about other things, smaller things, the kind of things you talk about when you are no longer circling the important conversation and have instead had it and can now exist on the other side of it." When we left, she held the door. On the pavement outside on North Clark, in the March cold, she stood with her coat buttoned and looked at me with the composure that was real and, underneath it, something that was no longer being hidden, just held, carefully, the way she held everything. She said, "I'll walk back with you." I said, "You drove." She said, "I know. I'll get the car later." We walked back toward Lincoln Park in the March cold, 12 blocks, at a pace that had nothing to do with efficiency. We talked about a building she had seen in Barcelona that had stayed in her mind, and about adaptive reuse in a city that valued newness over memory. Outside the brownstone, she stopped at the wrought iron gate. She said, "Thank you for dinner." I said, "Thank you for asking." She looked at the building, then at me. She said, "The courtyard rose is going to come back in April." I said, "You said June." She said, "This winter was mild. The canes are further along than I thought." I looked at her. She said, "I was checking them this morning." I said, "You were checking the rose this morning." She said, "I check it every morning. I have been checking it since October." The March air was cold, and the streetlight was doing something specific to her face, and she was looking at me in the way she had been managing not to look at me for 4 months fully, without the professional container around it, without the composure doing double duty as a wall. I said, "Imogen." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to be here in April." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to be here in June when it blooms." She said, "I know that too." I said, "I'm going to be here next year." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like that." I touched her jaw. Just that. Warm skin, the particular warmth of a face that has been outside in March cold and is still warm underneath. She went very still, not the professional stillness, not the managed stillness, the other kind. The kind that is not armor, but presence. I said, "Is this all right?" She said, "Yes." I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was the opposite of frantic, slow and certain and patient, the way things are when they have been earned by everything that came before them. Her hand came to my arm and stayed there, not possessive, not desperate, present. The specific weight of someone choosing to be exactly where they are. When we separated, she looked at me in the March air with her hand still at my arm, and the composure finally doing only one job, holding the feeling in, rather than the world out. She said, quietly, "I approved the lease because I needed to know you were all right." I said, "I know." She said, "I've known you were all right since the laundry room." I said, "I've been all right since I stopped running." She looked at me. She said, "When did you stop?" I said, "When I stayed." She nodded once. The careful, real nod of someone who has taken in accurate information and is going to act on it. She said, "Come in for a while." I said, "Yes." We went inside through the wrought iron gate and through the building door, and in the foyer, The familiar smell of cedar and old stone settled around us. Imogen held the inner door, and we went into the ground floor apartment, and it looked, in the late evening, with a lamp on over the drafting table and the kitchen warm from whatever she had been doing before the hearing, like the fullest version of itself. She made tea. It was a practical thing to do, and she was a practical person, and the practicality of it, after 4 months of charged corridors and building app messages, was one of the most intimate things I had witnessed. We sat at her kitchen table with our tea, and the printing factory drawings spread across the surface between us, marked in the specific, careful way of someone who has been living with a problem long enough to reach all its edges. And I looked at her work, and she told me about it, and neither of us pretended that the table was anything other than the distance it was, which was now a distance that could be crossed. At some point, she said, "You should see the factory before you write the piece." I said, "I already have." She looked up from the drawings. I said, "February, the public comment session, and the Thursday in April." She said, "You came in February, before I asked you." I said, "The covenant mechanism was always going to be newsworthy." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back at the drawings. She said, "The 4th floor is the most interesting one. When the light comes through the east windows in the morning, it does something to the timber framing that I have been trying to describe to clients for 2 years, and cannot." I said, "What does it do?" She said, "It makes the building look like it is being remembered from the inside. Like the light is not arriving from outside but rising from within the material itself." I looked at her. She said, "That is not an architectural description. Forget I said it." I said, "I'm not going to forget you said it." She looked at the drawings. The drafting lamp hummed. The tea was almost gone. She said, "Thursday. You should see it in the morning when you write the piece." I said, "Thursday." We stayed like that for an hour. The drawings between us became gradually less of a subject and more of an object, something on the table we were both aware of without looking at. The way you are aware of a closed door when the conversation has moved to what's on the other side. When I stood to leave, she walked with me to the door. In the doorway, she touched my hand, just that, the back of my hand with her fingers, briefly, present, warm, the specific warmth of someone choosing to make contact and meaning it. She said, "Good night." I said, "Good night." I went upstairs in the elevator, holding the button for 3 seconds, and stood in my apartment in the dark, looking out the east-facing casements at the city and the dark line of the lake. I thought about the weight of a hand at a jaw in March air and what it felt like to have chosen something and stayed inside the choice. It felt like a building, like walls that remembered what they had been built for. April arrived, and the Paul's Himalayan musk put out its first tentative growth, small green shoots at the tips of the canes, the kind of beginning that is easy to miss if you are not looking for it. I was looking. I had been looking since March. Imogen showed me on a Thursday morning, standing in the courtyard with our coffees before she left for a site visit. She pointed at the canes with the same economy she brought to everything, just the gesture, no preamble. I said, "You were right, April." She said, "Mild winter." I said, "You said that in March." She said, "I've been saying it since December." I looked at her. She was looking at the canes with the expression she had when she was satisfied with how something was developing, not smug, just correct. The face of someone whose structural assessment has been vindicated by actual structure. I said, "Come have dinner with me tonight." She said, "I have site drawings to finish." I said, "Finish them and then have dinner." She looked at me. She said, 7 o'clock. I said, "I'll cook." She looked at me. She said, "You cook?" I said, "I've been learning." The corner of her mouth, that millimeter. On the first Thursday in April, I went to the printing factory with her. The building was 6 stories of Chicago brick, the color of dried clay, with window openings that had been boarded and unboarded across different decades. The developer's scaffolding was on the east face. Imogen's preservation plan was on the west. She walked me through it with the hard hat and the site vocabulary and the particular attention of someone who had been inside this building enough times to know its specific sounds, the upper floors moving differently from the lower ones. The original timber framing visible across the fourth floor, the place where the brick had been badly repointed in the 80s, and was going to be done correctly. She said. The developer wanted to open this wall entirely. She indicated a run of original brick. They argued a glass curtain wall preserved the structural character. I argued that the character of this wall is its mass and its opacity, and that substituting transparency for solidity is not preservation, it is replacement, I said. And the permit board agreed. She said. The permit board read the covenant correctly. I said. You wrote the brief for them. She said. I wrote the technical analysis. Renata wrote the historical context. The board did its job. I looked at the wall beside her. The brick was warm in the morning light, not red, not orange, something between, the specific color of a material that has been in a city for 100 years and has absorbed the light of it. I said. It does remember. She turned. I said. The wall, you can see it. It knows what it was. She looked at the brick. Then at me. Something in her face was doing the open thing, not managed, not professional. She said, yes. We stood in the printing factory with the city making its sounds at the edges, and I thought about a wall that remembered what it had been built for and was still standing inside that memory. She came at 7 for dinner. I had made something with pasta and a sauce that had taken me 2 hours longer than it should have, which I did not tell her. She ate it with full attention, and did not say it was good in the easy way. She said, specifically, the shallots are right. The timing is off on the pasta, but the shallots are right. I said, I'll take shallots. She said, it's a good start. We did the dishes together in the kitchen with the window over the sink that looked down into the courtyard, and the lamplit courtyard below showed the rose canes with their April shoots bright at the tips, and I stood at the sink with a dish towel and looked at the woman beside me who had built this window, deliberately, so that whoever lived up here could see the thing worth seeing, and I understood that the window had always been about something she had not known yet, would matter, a tenant she had not yet imagined, a life she had not yet let herself want. She said, what are you thinking? I said, that you built this window so I could see the rose. She said, I built this window for the light. I said, you built it so whoever lived up here could see the courtyard. She was quiet. I said, I think you've been preparing this building for someone to come home to for a long time. She dried her hands. She turned to look at me. She said, I think that might be accurate. I said, I think I'm the someone. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was the open one now, not the composure stripped away, but the composure used differently, the way she had described using it in Renata's description of her, holding rather than hiding. She said, I think you are too. She was very close. The kitchen was warm with the smell of the pasta and the dish soap and cedar, and her face in the kitchen light had none of the professional management in it, just the thing underneath, which had always been the thing I had been most afraid of losing and was no longer afraid of. She said, I have not been in love with anyone since you left. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know that wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I knew what the thing was supposed to feel like. I was not going to settle for less of it. I said, I know. She said, I'm telling you because I need you to understand the weight of what I'm saying when I tell you. I said, I know what you're saying. She looked at me. I said, I have known since the laundry room, since the elevator, since you said more difficult than I anticipated without looking at me. She said, then why did you wait? I said, because you needed to say it. Not because I needed to hear it. She stood with that for a moment. She moved a half step closer and touched my jaw the way I had touched hers in the March air outside the gate, just that warm skin, the back of her fingers, brief and certain and patient. She said, I love you. I have loved you since we were 22, and I never stopped, and I am done managing it as if it were a problem to be contained. I said, it's not a problem. She said, no, it's not. She kissed me. Slow, patient. The way the whole thing had been earned by every inch of the distance between October and April, by every building app message and laundry room conversation, and December open house and North Side permit hearing, and Thursday dinner with late pasta and correct shallots. Nothing frantic, everything present. When we separated, she kept her hand at my face, her thumb against my cheekbone. The specific weight of someone who is choosing to stay where they are and knows exactly what the choice costs and has decided it is worth it. I said, I love you. I said it the way you say things when they have been true for a long time and you are finally done being afraid of them. She said, I know. I said, good. She said, 12 months. I said, and then, she said, and then, the rose opened in May. Not June-May, because the winter had been mild and the canes were further along than anticipated, and the thing that has been tended through the cold always comes back faster than you expect. I found it on a Tuesday morning at the window over the sink, 2 blooms fully open on the highest cane. Pale pink, with the particular fragrance that climbing roses have, not heavy, not sweet, just present and specific, and impossible to mistake for anything else. I called down through the building intercom, which I had never used before and which produced a sound like a ship's bell in the foyer. Imogen answered from her apartment with a voice that was fully awake, which meant she had already been up and working. I said, the rose is open. A pause. She said, I told you, May. I said, you told me June. She said, I revised it in April. I said, come up. She said, I have a 7 o'clock. I said, it's 6:42. A pause. She said, I'll be up in a minute. She stood at the kitchen window in her work clothes with her coffee and looked at the blooms below with the expression she had when something she had tended had done exactly what she built it to do, not surprised, just satisfied. Correct. I stood beside her. She said, Paul's Himalayan musk, planted by a tenant in the spring of the year I finished the restoration. I said, and you kept it. She said, it was a good rose. I said, you kept it because it was something worth keeping. She looked at me. She said, yes. The building hummed around us. The morning light came through the east-facing casements. Below, in the courtyard that she had designed with this window so that whoever lived up here could see it, the rose was open. I said, you're going to be late. She said, I know. She stayed anyway. 4 more minutes at the window with her coffee. 4 minutes watching the rose and the light and the courtyard she had built for a life that had not arrived yet when she designed it. Then she put the coffee down and kissed me, briefly, with the full certainty of someone who knows they are going home at the end of the day. She picked up her portfolio case from the chair by the door where she had started leaving it. She said, I'll be back at 6. I said, I'll cook. She said, the shallots, Rowan. I said, I know, the shallots. She left. I heard the elevator, the 3-second button, the doors closing. I stood at the window in the morning light with my coffee and the open rose below and the city beyond the wrought iron gate, and I thought about walls that hold stories. About buildings responsible to the life inside them. About the specific patience required to tend something through a long winter and wait for it to come back. It always comes back. If you have been holding something carefully enough, that was what she had been doing. All of it, the application, the lease, the open house and the courtyard heater and the building app and the December not uninterested and the March permit hearing and the April shoots. All of it, the architecture of someone holding a condition open long enough for something to grow into it. I had grown into it. I was going to stay grown. Professor Osei knocked on my door that afternoon. He was carrying a small plant, a cutting from the garden-level space he tended, and handed it to me with the unhurried satisfaction of a man distributing what he had grown. He said, for the drafting table, it does well indoors. He looked at the apartment with the clear attention of someone noting how a space has changed. He said, the building suits you. I said, I think so. He said, Imogen chose the right tenant. She always does. But this time, she chose correctly for different reasons. He excused himself. I put the plant where the afternoon light hit it and went back to work. The form piece on the North Side printing factory ran on the first Thursday in May, 3 days after the rose opened. The headline used the word covenant because Renata had been right, the covenant mechanism was the news. The piece ran long, 6,000 words. with photographs that a colleague had taken in February when the building was still under dispute and the developer was still presenting the glass curtain wall as an act of historic sensitivity. The main photograph was the facade, brick and timber, 6 stories, the kind of structure that remembered what it had been built for and was still standing inside that memory. Imogen read it the same morning it posted. She sent a message, not the building app, that said, "You got the building right." I wrote back, "I had good source material." She wrote, "The 4th floor, the light description." I wrote, "You said it." I wrote it. She wrote, "I told you to forget it." I wrote, "I never agreed to that." A pause. Then she wrote, "The shallots are improving." I wrote, "The pasta timing is still off." She wrote, "You have time." I looked at those 2 words for a long time. Not reassurance, not permission, just a fact about the shape of what we had. Time. The thing that had felt like the enemy for 6 years and had turned out to be the resource. You cannot tend a thing to health in a hurry. You cannot hold a condition open for something to grow into it and simultaneously demand that it grow faster. She had known this since the day she saw my name on the lease application and approved it anyway. I had been learning it since October. Renata called that afternoon to say the piece had been picked up by 3 architecture publications and that the permit board chair had called it the most accurate account of a covenant dispute she had read in print. I said Imogen had already messaged me. Renata said, "Of course she did," with the brisk satisfaction of someone who has been watching a situation develop and is glad it has developed correctly. I said, "Did you know? When you mentioned me to her in March?" She said, "I know what I observe. I've known Imogen since she was a student, and I know what she looks like when she is managing something she would rather have." It was not my thing to say, it was yours. She hung up. I sat with that for a while, with the idea that the people paying attention had been watching this structure longer than I had known it existed, and that none of them had intervened because none of them needed to. It was already sound. It just needed time. At 6 o'clock, her key was in the lock. I heard it the way I had learned to hear it across 7 months, the specific sound of that particular key in that particular door, which is one of the most domestic sounds in the world and one of the most reliable. There are things you learn about a person only through proximity and repetition. The sound of their key, the weight of their step in a hallway, the way the building acknowledges their arrival before they have said a word. I had learned all of these things. I was still learning them. I was at the stove. The shallots were right. The pasta timing was better, not perfect, but better. The kitchen window was open a half-inch because the May evening was warm enough, and from the courtyard below, faint but specific, came the fragrance of the rose. She came into the kitchen and set her portfolio case on the chair by the door where she always set it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove and then at me. She said, "It smells better in here." I said, "The shallots." She said, I said, "The rose, I think," through the window. She looked at the half-open window, then at me. She said, "I checked the canes this morning. 4 more buds." I said, "In June it'll be covered." She said, "Yes." She crossed the kitchen without being asked, and stood beside me at the stove, and looked at what I was doing with the same evaluating attention she brought to structural problems, not taking over, just present. She had always been this kind of person. I had known it at 22 and had not understood what it meant until I was 29 in a kitchen in Lincoln Park, with a May rose opening 4 stories below. She said, "You need another minute on the pasta." I said, "I know. I'm watching it." She said, "Good." She stayed. The kitchen was warm and the May evening came through the half-open window, and somewhere below, in the courtyard she had designed, with the window placed deliberately so whoever lived up here could see it. The rose tended through a long winter, was doing what roses do when the conditions have finally been right long enough. It was, all of it, exactly what a building is supposed to do. Hold the conditions. Let the life inside it happen. I had signed a lease sight unseen in a city I was starting over in, and the door had opened, and behind it was every complicated thing I had spent 6 years deciding I did not deserve. The woman who had tended it through the interval. The rose kept for a tenant not yet imagined. The window placed so that whoever came would be able to see what was worth seeing. I was the whoever. I had arrived. I was not going anywhere.